So, I'm going to start off by saying, welcome to The World Spins on a Coin Russia, when the Imperial February Revolution fails. I'm also going to start off by saying this. I had a really fun experience yesterday, or rather will be yesterday by the time this comes out, but it's actually today in my time, but it was earlier today, a lot earlier today. I put up the video which was on the Japanese fighter, the Mitsubishi A5M, and I had managed to lose the slide apparently on the A4N in the section I talked about that, because I have recorded a section of video about that, the A4N, and B, had managed to, instead of talking about the A4N, had decided to talk about the Key 10 instead, which was the army plane. It's fun. I've taken that down now, or I'll privatize it, and I'm going to fix it, and I'm going to re-record it. All I can say is, I have got to stop taking legal phone calls in the middle of recording videos. My brain obviously can't deal with doing the two things. Apologies. So, then that those who haven't watched this video, my channel before, we're in the process of moving house, and I've been designated the family spokesman for dealing with the legal and the financial matters, and I'm doing my best. But I swear, moving house and all the stuff around is a whole different language from English. I honestly do swear it is a whole different language. And we need about 4 different lawyers involved because of the way we're having to do it. And it's fun. It's fun. I'm starting to feel like a bit like the Byzantine Empire, but we'll leave that to one side. It's rather appropriate to be talking about the Russian Empire. So, this was an alternate history question, which was set by as a patron question by C. Clarke. Imperial Russia does not collapse as it historically does and survives the Great War intact. And pretty much the pace of Russia collapsing. You could go back and say they win World War One dramatically early. You could say that maybe World War One doesn't happen. You could do all sorts of things. But I felt Russia collapsing, Imperial Russia collapsing, that's really the February Revolution. So I turn into this. The February Revolution fails and Imperial Russia survives. And that sets up some really interesting discussion points. It really does. Because Russia has a very complex connection with the rest of the world. It really, truly does. And it has a lot of interactions with things. If Russia is still the pre-World War One Russia, rather than the far more inwardly focused Soviet Union of the 1920s and 30s, which claimed to be externally focused, but was really very, very inward-looking. I mean, it's kind of like the reverse of the United States. The United States claims they are isolationist, and then you go, and you're doing what in Pacific areas and Asia and China? Yeah, but we're isolationist. We have whole naval patrols going up and down Chinese rivers and all sorts of things, and we are sticking our we have got our military based all around this part of the world. But we're isolationist. The Soviet Union is, we are global, but they're not actually doing anything. We are global, but yeah, you don't trust your navy to go beyond the Baltic because you're worried they're going to do something, or the Black Sea because you're worried they might not come back. It's wonderful fun. And I'm also going to start this video off, of course, with a shameless book plug, because, well, we've got a competition where 2 of them are up for prizes. And we have all sorts of things going on at the moment, but please, I do know, if you watch this channel, about 50% of you who watch this channel do not subscribe. But you watch the channel regularly. So thank you for watching the channel regularly. But I have a problem, which, if you watch this channel regularly, you will know, is that my mother and my aunt have a bet going. And the bet is it's between non-identical twins, so we won't even get. It is certainly not a serious financial bet. There was one person once who wrote a whole thing about gambling. We're talking about two ladies who have celebrated their 21st birthday for the 60th time. And B, so frankly, what they want to do, I'm not going to critique. And B, the exact the prize of the bet is familial bragging rights for winning the bet. And my mum has to bake my aunt a cake, or my aunt has to. I think now the price is because my aunt's won so many times, so now she has to buy a spa weekend or something for my mum. My aunt feels that confident she's going to win. The thing is, I have to get to 15,000 subscribers by Christmas 2024. That means by 23:59 hours on the 24th of December UK time, GMT, I have to be at 15,000 subscribers. So all suggestions in the comments below, please. All suggestions. And to the person who once suggested, well, cancel your channel and then, it won't be a competition. No, she'll still claim that as a win. So no, that's not happening. And also, I'm not giving up my channel for my mum to win the bet. I love her dearly. And she is the person who brought me into this world, and probably the person who could take me out of this world. But leaving that to one side, this channel is fun. And talking to all of you about history is fun. So how could Imperial Russia survive? Well, someone actually did suggest a different thing. They said, well, what happens if the Guards regiments aren't actually sent to the front, because they're not that much useful on the front? The question is, I don't know if the Guards regiments would be any useful actually in the cities as a defense against the uprisings. They would be something. They would be more reliable than the forces they had on hand, and would certainly give them numbers, but I think they could actually face trouble earlier if they don't do the symbology of the Guards going to the front. Although, there again, if the Guards don't go to the front, perhaps, we can always hope the Tsar, who is, of course, like Wilhelm, who started this whole war by doing all his actions, such a font of military genius, might not go to the front and actually take charge. The fact that when he does go to the front and take charge, he is actually an improvement on many of the structures already there, and actually does manage to start organizing things, is both a damning indictment of the state of the Russian General Staff and quite an absurd scenario. It really is. So I'm not going to use the Guards regiment, although I have seen a couple of comments suggesting that, and I can see why, but I just don't think they're reliable enough. And I'm not sure if they would actually be able to hold it up, because eventually most of the soldiers are going to be going. The Guard soldiers are still recruited from the same people. So, Archangel Railway. That was a one idea I had, which was could we have that railway running properly? Could we get some proper supplies into the city so that the populations weren't starving, that there was enough goods flowing around? And no. Also support the military? No. It's too far away, it doesn't really work. Royal Navy wins Jutland and forces the Baltic, i.e. carries out the Fisher Plan. Ends the war probably in 1916. Could forestall the revolution, but let's be honest, the revolution doesn't take place that long afterwards. And if we consider the timeline for actually winning Jutland, forcing the Baltic, and actually being able to stabilize Russia, yes, Germany probably falls out the war quite quickly. If you have the Royal Navy parading up and down its Baltic coast, you are probably dealing with a Germany which is not going to be fighting for long. But is it going to be long enough? Also, the idea of just stopping Lenin getting back. Lenin, to me, I've always felt is more of a person who takes advantage of circumstance than actually creates circumstance. Even when we consider the earlier parts of the revolution, he becomes a dictator. He is definitely that. He is, though, someone who works through subordinates. And in many ways, he holds on to his position as dictator more through the fact that he can't be got rid of because of his reputation and projected image than his real skill and his reality. After all, if he'd truly been as strong and capable as he projected himself to be, I doubt he'd have needed the Stalin, the man of steel, around to assist him. And so that means we have to shift the change earlier. And honestly, we need ports. And if you can't go to the Baltic, which are probably the best ports to go to because you can get to St. Petersburg, the next best Russian ports are all in the Black Sea, which is the other side of the Dardanelles. Okay, so pretty much we've worked our way north to south on the ports. We've worked our way from the absolute worst ports to go to the pretty much best ports to go to from actually supplying logistics, but let's be honest, to do it, you have to get through German Navy, and you have to crash the Germans earlier on. Okay. We could always have Russia be sensible with the war and not get involved, but that's not going to happen, and that would change history too much. If you have that, then you have all sorts of things break down, and at a certain point with alternate histories, if you break it too much, you have no mooring point or points to actually consider with history. One of the things you have to think about is when you end this conflict, when this conflict ends. My view is that if you end World War I before America gets involved, you change the international relations landscape so much you can't really rejig it. You cannot imagine. If you have no American active involvement in World War I, all they do is the loans. And let's say war ends in 1916. Long before they get involved. Then there is no Washington Naval Treaty. There is no Naval Treaty scenario at all. Because let's be honest, Britain goes back to what it was probably before the war. France and Russia muddle along. You probably get a war between Britain and Russia at some point, with Japan on their side, on Britain's side, because let's be honest, Russia does keep trying to push for warm war supports, whether those ports were in India, Persia as it was at the time, or Turkey. It didn't really mind. It wanted the warm water ports that had open access to the sea, because that was considered a strategic imperative. Or China. The Russian Empire didn't care. It wasn't picky. It just wanted them. So you have a likelihood of that. You also have a scenario that if America hasn't been forced to get involved, considering their already interesting nature towards defense spending, and without the infrastructure and industrial build-up that does come from their involvement in World War I, let's be honest, the 4 Stacker-class destroyers and all those other things are massively due to their involvement in World War I, entirely due to their involvement in World War I in their sheer numbers. The US Navy was being allowed to build battleships. They were building battleships as part of a qualitative race with the British, but they're not building any cruisers at a time, and they're barely building any destroyers. It's a very interesting naval structure. It's literally a headline act only naval structure. We've got X number of battleships, aren't we powerful? And then there's the Royal Navy looking at them and going, where's the rest of the fleet? Yeah, we appreciate the battleships, we like the battleships, we're in a qualitative race with you for who has the best battleships, but where is the rest of the fleet? And the US Navy's going, Congress. And the Royal Navy goes, oh, we're so sorry, we have the Treasury, we understand, we feel your pain, we feel your pain, We understand, U.S. Navy. We understand. It's not on you. It's entirely Congress. We understand. We have the same fun explaining this to the Treasury. It's okay. It's okay. We're here for you. We're here for you. Let's set up a support group. The French aren't really in this because the French Navy does it to themselves with their own architects, but they have problems with their government too, so they're allowed to visit occasionally when they're feeling more sane. The Ranger Marina are here because their government never understood the terms long-term investment. The Japanese Navy's here because they just keep taking out anyone who has an actual ability to actually do accountancy. It's just terrible. We're all here for each other. We're here. It's the support group. I know. I'm off on one, but it's the gag which goes around in my head every time I'm looking at these ships. But as I said, if you change World War One too much, you change it so much that we cannot really work it out. Because if you have let's say World War One end due to a bit of the Battle of Jutland, and the battleships scream in, fight this big, massive battle. Its decisive power was the battleship, the big gun. What does that do? How's that going to affect things? Especially if people are still building battleships because there's no Washington Naval Treaty. It's just... the world's going to be completely different. And you can't really predict for that. And so that is another issue with that one. So therefore there's Gallipoli. Gallipoli is not going to randomly end World War One early. It's going to end it earlier because it's going to keep the Russians in the war. Because you're going to be able to supply them with food and stuff. But you have to do it right. And I've done a video on how to actually carry out Gallipoli. Basically, first rule, do not try and storm the forts with your battleships first, and not properly prepared battleships, and tell the enemy you're coming. 2, make sure you have troops there for when you do attack. 3, take some of your older, I would call them Royal Sovereign style battleships. Most people call them pre-dreadnoughts. I don't like naming them for something which comes after them because it seems wrong. Because let's be honest, if you're talking about just using the phrase pre-dreadnought, HMS Victory, the ship that Nelson uses his flagship, is a pre-dreadnought because it is before dreadnought. This is why I do not like using before dreadnought as a designation. I know it was used at the time. It was a quick, snappy thing of the newspapers, but then you've got Lord Nelson and Agamemnon, which are actually completed after HMS Dreadnought, and they are British pre-dreadnoughts, though. It's just fun. So you take some of these older style battleships, and what you do is you fit them with big bulges, anti-torpedo mine bulges, and you fill those bulges, and you fill the forward compartments with cork. You fill them up. You fill as many compartments up as you can with cork, and seal them. So they're full of cork and they're sealed. And then you charge through the minefield. Yes, you have enough crew on to man the guns and keep the engines going, but you have them as minimally crewed as possible. Now the rest of the ship's following behind, but you have maybe 8, 10 of these at the front. Going through, preferably with nets cast and things, so that they really do soak up the mines and take out the mines as they go through. The odds are you will lose some. But with enough cork in them, they will sink slowly. You won't lose any crew. And more importantly, they will take a lot of mines with them before they actually sink. A lot of mines with them before they actually sink. And it will mean you will probably, quite probably, be able to get to Constantinople within hours. Hours. And then you land your troops. You force your way through your minefield. Maybe you probably landed some troops a long way to attack the various forts, if you're sensible, and then you land the majority of your troops in Constantinople. And that probably, hopefully, causes A, the Ottoman Empire to fall out of the war. B, it gives you a guaranteed route to Russia's ports to send them resupplies of arms, ammunition, food, fuel, aircraft, everything they need, because they're going to need everything. This is another reason why you want America to still, you don't want to do anything which is going to keep America completely out of the war, because you're probably going to need their industrial might to turn on at some point. Admittedly, their industrial might is nowhere near what it is in World War II. Please don't get that idea. But their raw materials, oh, frigate, they were useful in World War One. So, yeah, you need their raw materials. And then, with that coming through, and the Allies more engaged, and a massive victory, because, let's be honest, the Allies have taken Constantinople, Istanbul, Byzantium, whatever you want to call it, depending on which person you are in this time period and wanting to call it for political reasons, the Allies have taken it. What the Tsar will want at that point to do is to send some troops to it, because if he gets any troops there, he's going to be able to trumpet a victory so massive, so loud, so great. Such a victory which is so wedded into the Orthodox Church in Russia that it will probably give him just long enough to actually fight the war and sort things out. There was a discussion about whether or not he should abdicate to his brother, as he did historically, as well alive, or whether he would be succeeded by his son. I am honestly not sure. I have a feeling if he lives long enough and secures it well enough, and the son gets old enough, he might well pass it on to his son. There is going to be an interesting scenario with his daughters, but I have a feeling they are incredibly loyal to their brother and incredibly reluctant to leave Russia. And let's be honest, one of the problems with World War I is you do, even inadvertently, take out quite a lot of royal families. Let's be honest, the Austrians are gone. By the end of the Austrian Habsburg royal family will be gone because of the war. So will the Germans. Let's be honest, they're going to go. So yeah, a lot of royal families will be gone. And others will be quite careful about who they marry. So I don't think that really helps our Russians to do external marriages. It doesn't seem to. The February Revolution is an interesting revolution. It's probably one of the most interesting coalitions, because as a coalition they're not actually that coherent. They really aren't. And they have a lot of very diverse aims, which is one of the reasons why it's so important which faction ends up with control of the Tsar. I think if I'd been him, I would have called my family together before the abdication. I'd have moved them, got them all together, and then the moment I abdicated, I would have left the country. Abdicated. He's doing it, I think, on a railway carriage. He was doing it on a railway carriage, writing up the abdication or something similar to that. And I would have just gone on the train wherever I could get to. Don't think the Germans did let Lenin across the border, so they might let him across the border and go to Denmark, and then from Denmark get. The British wouldn't want the Russian royal family to come to Britain itself, but they might not be too upset about them ending up in Canada. Nice, safe place for them to end up. But who knows? Who knows? As it was, the Tsar didn't. The Tsar did not. And he was not the smartest in the world. And let's be honest, his foreign policy was one of the reasons why they were in the trouble they were. Now, let's start off with Russia survives World War I. What's the first thing that happens? Well, one of the curious absences at the Treaty of Versailles, if you look at it, is Russia. Russia is not present. Now, Russia would have been even more hardline than the French. They would have wanted a lot of the Kaiserlich Marines' modern cruisers. Nuremberg, Edinburgh, Emden, Frankfurt would have been just 3 of the ones they've been really after. And they would have really wanted them to have their weight felt. Remember, they have just won a glorious war. They will probably already be starting to work, no matter what the reality. What the reality doesn't matter. They will be already recasting the history, because, let's be honest, this is what Russian governments do successively. And lots of nations do this to an extent with their histories. Let's be honest. We can all think of wars which are portrayed as glorious victories, and then you look at the evidence and you go, was that really a glorious victory? Or did we just barely hang in there? Or are we recasting a draw, or perhaps even possibly a loss as a glorious victory? I'm not saying which wars I'm thinking of, but I can think of them for almost every nation. But let's be honest, Russia has suffered many defeats prior to this. They need, if this is a win, it's going to be a glorious win. They are going to completely forget or write out any bits of the history which are inconvenient. That includes possibly any mention of the British involvement in their victory. Because remember, it's traditionally the Franco-Russian alliance. And they're going to want this to be the Franco-Russian alliance, because they're going to want to build that alliance and make it stronger. Because, well, let's be honest, their plans don't stop with Germany. They really don't. They really don't stop with just Germany. I wish they did, but they aren't going to stop with that. You know, as I already mentioned and alluded to, Germany has, well, Russia has ambitions. It really does. And Germany is a good point for them. It's a good starting point, but it's not going to be the ending point. It's not going to be where they are. And before we get into the realities of the Versailles Treaty, we should probably consider how the map changed historically in this period. And if I move that up so I can actually get my hands around it, that's better. Right then, so historically, this is the German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this is what's happened by 1923. But I do not see Poland existing in this scenario. If Russia survived, and Russia is part of the winning powers, I'm not sure. I don't know if Poland survives. Poland is created. I doubt the Baltic states that comes into existence. I wouldn't be surprised if Austro-Hungarian Empire gets broken up, as it does, but I think also Germany will be broken up. I think Russia is sufficiently hard-line, they would want Germany broken up. There would certainly be no tolerance of German enclave this close to Russia. No, they'll be pushing it back. They'll be taking every bit of territory they can get their hands on, and they'll be weakening Germany in every way they can. And first things first, they're going to want to break it up. They're going to want to send it back to pre-Bismarck, to the German states. That's what they're going to want to do. They do not want to unify Germany in the center of Europe. It's far too powerful, and it's far too much of a threat to both them and France. Remember, Britain was the key one in setting up, a key power in helping to set up the unified Germany. Why? Because the unified Germany served Britain's interests in offsetting the powers of France and Russia. It was useful. What happens into this scenario, of course, is Germany decides that the sensible thing for it to do is to start building and do a building race against a traditional ally, and go them almost into joining everyone else in a war against them, which they promptly lose, because traditionally they've provided a very strong army which has had continual access to the global logistics and trade system because the British Royal Navy guaranteed it. That's how they'd won their wars previously. Even when the British were neutral in the Franco-Prussian War. Let's be honest, British neutrality was guaranteed as long as Russia was neutral. If Russia joined in, then they knew Britain might well join in, and They didn't want that, and neither did France. And that was the scenario they had to run in. So, I do not see this Europe of 1923 existing. I also think that Turkey is very different. My strong suspicion is the British will make sure they bring some Greek troops with them. They were already doing this. If you think about several operations Dardanelles, we often think about the Australians and New Zealanders involved in it. There are a lot of British troops there. There are also a lot of Greek troops running around and being close by, because I think Britain has this idea in its head of, okay, we need to keep Russia satisfied, Istanbul has to end up under the control of an Orthodox Christian power. If it ends up under Greek Orthodox Christian power, that's useful for us, because you can't really do the same level of holy war against them, and it means Russia still doesn't have control of the Straits of Dardanelles. And even more fun, perhaps the Straits of Dardanelles and control them is split between two countries, which makes it even more interesting for administration and complicated for the Russians to deal with. I mean, I'm sure the British wouldn't purposely be aiming for such a confused scenario because it would limit the ability of Russian expansion. I'm sure the British would never play any political games like that. But we are talking about getting into the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles, it's going to be interesting. It's not going to be just the Big Four. Now, if you don't have America there at all, if America is not there because the war ends soon enough, the Americans don't get involved. You don't have to deal with Wilson's 14 points, which everyone would not be upset about missing, because let's be honest, they all pretty much ignored them completely. But you would also have a scenario probably of America viewing whatever was done to Germany and Austria and Austria-Hungary as being some kind of European imperial plot. It would be quite so ruthless. So this is helpful having the Americans there. But if you have the Russians there, you therefore have two nations which are hardline everything. They're going to be the Big Five. You're going to have Britain, moderate in everything but maritime naval capabilities. They want to ruin German infrastructure. I have said this once, I have said this twice, I have said this many, many times, but the secret to British security in World War II is the fact that they wrecked German maritime infrastructure in the Treaty of Versailles. The reason why the best ships the Germans can build in World War II are, at various points, the Deutschlands, followed by the Scharnhorst, followed by the Bismarcks, and not something a lot better. And if you look at their otherwise tech base, they should have been able to produce something even bigger and better, is because of the way the infrastructure has been damaged and systematically undermined in the Treaty of Versailles. That was the British aim all along. That was what the British went in to do. They did it very successfully. It meant that when they end up with war with Germany, at no point does Germany have more than usually 2 capital ships available. They peak at sort of being able to claim 4 when Tirpitz is in testing, Bismarck goes out to sea, and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are recovering in French ports. Though they theoretically on paper have 4 capital ships at that point. But the whole reason they are so limited by, when people say, the German Plan Z for their great strength and their idea of growing a navy is going to take them so frigating long, is quite simple. It's due to the British the Treaty of Versailles, which the British had implemented in terms of the damage to their maritime and naval infrastructure. That was the entire policy. They did it. It's not something bad about the Germans. It's just that they literally could not invest, and by the time they could invest, they are so far behind the curve, they cannot catch up in terms of numbers or in terms of building something to their equivalent capabilities. So as good as those ships are, they aren't as good as, if you look at the rest of the German tech investment going on, proportionally, what should they have been? America is a moderating influence, as I discussed. Italy is grieving, but relishes the opportunity for sticking it to them. And Japan is looking for affirmation and confirmation of getting the German territories in the Far East. There is a really interesting scenario here that Britain, Japan end up backing each other up in the face of the Franco-Russian alliance. Italy's trying to play for its best things, and the Americans possibly end up siding with the British and the Japanese because that's the closest to moderates they've got. Because the Japanese don't really care. They want the treaty. They want territories in the Far East, and they want to be part of the victors. But they don't really care about anything else. Nothing else really matters to them in this one. The British are fairly moderate because they want to be quite so hardline on one area. They're prepared to be moderate on the other, all the others. To get that, France wants to squeeze the German, wants to clutch the German pips till they squeak, sort of thing. Squeeze them till they squeak. Sometimes it's translated as. It's a tough scenario, but I think you come out of it with a Treaty of Versailles which is going to be harsher. It is going to be even harsher than the actual treaty was. But I think you also come out of it with a loose gathering of peoples. I think Italy's probably trying to sit in the middle, but remember, they have a lot of grievances with the French. They have a lot of grievances with the French. France and Russia are going to be the old alliance, and they are going to be tag teaming with the world. They want to now readdress what has happened to them over the years, the cruelty they've suffered at the hands of the Germans, the insults. They want to redress against this, so they're going to keep on pushing around the world. And Britain and America and Japan are to an extent very happy with the status quo that's been achieved. They're going to want to keep it. And America is probably still going to be isolationist, but if the French are playing around in the Far East, that's a problem for them. And the Russians also going to be a problem for them. And one of the interesting things you have to realize when looking at history is when the Russians, the Soviet Union, are fighting the Japanese in China towards World War II in timeline. The Americans are actually considering whether they should be supporting the Japanese. As much as they dislike Japan and they don't like what Japan's doing in China, they don't want the Soviet Union in there either. And they're not much more keen on Russia. It's a sad state of affairs, but truly in international relations, it is school playground rules. It is. It's strife all over. Now, I don't think Russia's necessarily having a peaceful time. If they're continuing the Russification of Finland, that's going to definitely be a civil war. And with Russification of other territories, I could see them having to deal with the revolutionary zeal, which they will sort of tamper down with with a massive victory in Gallipoli and winning World War One. These things, these victories, the supplies, all those things, will sort of tamp it down, but it won't have tamped it down enough in areas where there are specific things to rally around. So instead of you dealing with a general revolution, you're going to be dealing with revolutions in certain areas. And those are going to be strong. And also could well be well funded. I mean, again, if you are Britain or America or any of the countries involved who realistically would prefer Russia to keep its concentration within its own empire, at least short term while you stabilise yourself post World War One, it's going to be incredibly tempting to supply them. And you don't even have to do it directly. You can make sure some money drops off in Sweden for Finland. And the Swedes always have a very good arms industry. They can get something across the Baltic quietly and efficiently. They could even do it over land if they really wanted to, but let's be honest, that could get so much more complicated. Because let's be honest, the land border is far smaller and far easier to patrol than the sea border. Oh, I think with Russia, the desire to seek and destroy the enemy in and to find the enemy within is going to outweigh some necessarily their better demons, or rather better angels, in going, we don't want to do this. And I think Russification will come back. And I think it will bite them with a vengeance. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the 1920s they are facing multiple civil wars. Smaller scale than maybe a national crisis, but they're still going to have it. And they're going to have to be managing it. Which brings us to the League of Nations. Historically, Russia didn't join till 1934. The Soviet Union didn't join until 1934. This is another reason why I say Wilson arriving is important, because without Wilson and his 14 points, there is no League of Nations. If you have no League of Nations, there is so much of the weirdest and most contrived politics of the 1920s and 30s doesn't exist. The League of Nations doesn't exist. A lot of the frameworks, a lot of the systems that created a lot of the scenarios that come about are due to the contact and discussions of the League of Nations. It's a precursor in many ways for the United Nations, but it is even more toothless. You could argue it would have more teeth if Russia joined in 1920, but you'd also say that if America doesn't join when they set up in 1920, and Russia and Japan, France, Britain, Italy, all in there, that could have an impact. That could have a really big impact. And America might well be forced to join the League of Nations, despite their isolationist tendencies, literally because can they afford? And in 1920, do their public and their political systems expect to be able to afford such a organization to be formed, and for them to not be involved? Because all you need is for Britain to go, who wants to be inaugural president of the League of Nations? And the Tsar go, me! And Britain go, do we care who takes the leadership of a nominal board? Probably not. But let's be honest, Britain being the leading nation or France being the leading nation is very different for American politics than the Russian Tsar being leadership of the League of Nations. Theoretically, the preeminent national leader in the world. That's gonna be complicated. That is going to be interesting. So yes, these are Finnish forces. Actually, I am very, very certain Baltic states, Finland, lots of it, and maybe even Poland, if the territory's been entirely united and within Russia, will be absolute hotbeds of violence, and Russia will be dealing with that. And that is going to be a very interesting scenario for the Russians, because how they approach that is going to affect how they're dealing with international relations and what happens next. The thing is, though, and I am most certain of this, Germany would not be Germany. Which could well mean, whilst the mustachioed gentleman might actually still rise to power in one of the former constituent states of Germany, whatever power they achieve is going to be far, far less. And their first thing is going to have to be said about reuniting Germany, and that will probably be a nightmare, because there'll be all sorts of politicians fighting for who should be in charge. And people going, hang on, Treaty of Versailles says you can't unite. And I can guarantee that'll be in the treaty. And again, if you're not dealing with a unified German state, even with the limited armed forces allowed on the treaty system, if you're not dealing with a unified German armed state, and that is the basis to develop from. But in the mid to sort of 1930s, you seize power in one of those small states, and you start trying to advocate for reunification. The French or Russians could well march in with whatever forces they have, because they're probably going to have a lot more than you have, and especially under the Treaty of Versailles scenario. So, Washington Naval Treaty. Oh, that's going to be a fun one. Russia joining the treaty. The Anglo-Japanese alliance was an anti-Franco-Russian alliance at its base point. That was literally what it was set up for. If France joined the war against Japan, or any scenario where that Russia called upon France to fight against Japan, Britain would get involved in it. If Britain found itself in a war with Russia, if France tried to get involved, Japan would get involved with that. And basically, it was guaranteed. If there is a war where we get attacked by 2 or more powers, we get backup. If there isn't such a scenario, if it's one-on-one, we're able to fight it out ourselves. It's honourable. But there are going to be treaty changes, because where would Russia want to be on this list? And where will the powers accept them on the list? Because if Russia comes in and demands, we want parity with Britain and the United States, Britain will never accept that. United States will laugh at them, and Japan will go, no. Parity with Japan? Japan's not going to like that. Admittedly, if you have parity with Japan, then you either have your entire navy in your Far Eastern fleet, or you have no navy in the Far Eastern fleet. Because kind of like France, when they find themselves with parity with Italy, they either have all their forces facing off against Italy and can protect their Mediterranean holdings from Italy, which is their biggest threat, or they can protect the rest of their empire. If Russia is limited to the same level as Japan, they're in trouble. And ask for more than Japan? No, their navy in no way can't ask for more than Japan. They're not going to get it. So that's going to cause a nightmare. Where they're listed, how they're listed, what happens with those listings. I honestly don't think the cumulative tonnages get through. My firm belief, my very, very firm belief when it comes to this, is that Russia and the rest of the powers will agree some sort of limitations on individual ships. Now, again, it's going to take longer for them actually to get implemented, and I think the British might play a slightly more forward game of construction. So I think you might actually see the G3s constructed. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans continue their construction as well, because they're trying to make to the point to the Russians that if the longer you hold off on agreeing to this treaty and demanding status, the more we can build. And both of them can build them. But the problem is, if those ships come into service, enough of them into service, you're going to have a very difficult time claiming less than 50,000 tons and 16.5-inch guns as your standard displacement and your gunnery limit. You may be able to get away with 45,000 tons. You may. Just. But you're not going to get ahead with less than 16.5-inch guns, 420mm, because that's what the G3s are armed with. And before anyone starts going and looking them up elsewhere, etc., all sorts of places, I have read I've got books behind me I can point out back to you, and the thing is, they will talk about the program, which was the 16-inch gun program, and then they'll give the stats for the G3, which was the 16.5-inch gun. And what you have is you have a 16.5-inch gun, which does fit with the British progression, because they're going for 15-inch, then 16.5-inch, then 18-inch, because they go up in 1.5-inch standards. And then that's one of the reasons why they do the whole redevelopment of using German ideas and their testing of German guns, which apparently reveals certain things, and it's found to be not the truth when they're developing the 16-inch gun, which goes in Nelson and Rodney. But that's a 16-inch gun, not a 16.5-inch gun. The 16.5-inch gun basically consider it a scaled-up 15-inch gun, because that's pretty much what my strong suspicion from the discussions of it was going to be. I think it was a 16.5-inch 45, maybe slightly more, but I think it was 16.5-inch 45. The Royal Navy was working on for the G3s. And it's a capable weapon system. It's a capable idea. It's going to change things, though. I think if you can get through a system where you can agree an upper limit on what you can build in terms of a battleship and aircraft carrier. So let's say the aircraft carrier is limited to 27,000 tons. The capital ship is limited to, or let's say 33,000 tons if you're limiting it to 45,000 tons rather than 35,000 tons. And 16.5-inch guns, etc. as your limits. I think you get through a treaty maybe like that. And then people build to their ability within that treaty, infrastructure-wise, and what their national need is. So it basically stops the qualitative race. So no longer does Britain and America need to one-up each other. Could be kind of interesting, because if that does happen and they've stopped on, they have to agree 16.5-inch guns, then the Americans could be crying, because there is no way Congress is going to pay to replace all their 16-inch gun ships with 16.5-inch guns. And they're probably not going to give them a whole load of new 16.5-inch gun ships, because, let's be honest, they've got a whole load of 16-inch gun ships in service. A lot of them. They might complete them up. They might complete the Lexingtons, etc. in the South Dakotas. Do I think they build more than that? No, because the desire to build ships has passed. One of the interesting points is also that members of Congress like Tillman, who I did another video about recently, and his effect on the 1910s and his ideas of how ships should be built and developed. He is an interesting soul, but he's dead by this point. So are many others who propose to support a strong navy, and you're going to have to wait another 10, 15 years for the next generation to rise, who are going to support a strong navy. So you haven't really got them in the US. But I think the big thing is, if you try and put in tonnage limitations, where do you put Russia? Where does Russia accept, and where are you prepared to put Russia? And that's going to be a real trouble, which is why I think in the end, if you want any semblance of agreement, you get rid of the cumulative tonnage limitations, and you go for individual ship limitations. You can't build a ship which is more than 45,000 tons in standard. Yeah. You can't build something which is more than 16.5-inch guns. Okay, 420 mil, that's fine. You can't build an aircraft carrier which is more than 33,000 tons in standard. Okay. But otherwise you can build as many of those ships as you want. That's great. That'll be agreed. I think that's where they come. I think pretty much Articles 4 and Article 7 get deleted from the Washington Naval Treaty, and the treaty gets adjusted to reflect the ships which will be completed in its time, because I don't think any naval treaty will come through until 24, 25, because of the length of time it will take to get Russia to the negotiating table. Because one of Russia's priorities is going to be trying to build up its navy post-war. And what ships they've got is going to be incredibly important to that, because if they have got a load of German yards, but haven't got a load of German ships, because they, as historically, have sunk in Scapa Flow, well, the Royal Navy will not be unhappy, but the Russians will be unhappy. And so they'll be doing a building program, which again means other powers will respond. It's just, it's going to be fun, is what I'm saying. It's going to be a nice, complicated scenario. And really, I'm not willing to go further than the Washington Naval Treaty, because the honest fact is, you change so much by having Russia involved in all these things. that you change history completely. You've no longer got a Germany, in my mind. You no longer have a Germany as it was before. Germany broken up like Austro-Hungary was. You know, the main reason the French were prepared to accept Germany staying as one nation was they felt it was better to pay reparations, but even they were considering splitting it up at one point. And they had no support arguing and supporting them for that. Was the Russians arguing supporting them for that? It might actually get done, because does Britain really care enough to stop it? Or rather, do they care? It strategically would be a problem for them because they lose their buffer state in Europe. And let's be honest, the next best option after that is Italy, and that's not really that well located for it. But Germany has turned out to be a political handful. It's got a mind of its own, and that's not helpful in a buffer state army that you can rely on. And who knows what happens? With a broken up Germany and a Poland going for independence, that might swallow up some of those parts, and it could become a very interesting little powerhouse. There's all sorts of options if you play the long game. But seeing beyond the 1920s, yeah, that's not going to happen. That just doesn't happen in this scenario. It's just, it would be a long discussion, honestly, to do it, and you would need the aid of multiple complex diplomatic and economic economic projection systems to basically crunch a huge amount of data to try and figure it through. And even then, it will be based on so many guesstimates that far out. It's basically writing fiction. And you could argue that what I am talking about has been fiction, but the thing is, by keeping the change that brings it about small enough, Gallipoli succeeds because it's done properly, which they did actually understand and know what to do, and there were actually people articulating how it should be done, but they didn't do it at the time. You can actually keep it fairly small. You can keep those differences fairly small, and you can still use historical points as base points to go to, because there's still going to be a Washington Treaty, I think. There's still going to be that consideration. There's enough people articulating for it. I don't, as I said, think it goes through in 1922. I think the G3s are in service. The N3s might well be in one on the production when it finally goes in, which could be in a whole different kettle of fish. Because the N3s were supposed to be 18-inch gun ships. And, well, the thing is, if someone turns around and says you're not allowed to have more than 16.5-inch guns, the British have a 16.5-inch gun. Yes, the N3s are supposed to be roughly 48,500 tons, roughly, but you could probably fake that. You could probably drop it down enough if you replace those 9 18-inch guns with 16.5-inch guns, and claimed you filled the spaces that weren't being used by shells, and that extra weight of all hoists and all those other gears and turret space by the fact that you had 16.5-inch shells, etc. You could probably do that without too much effort. Probably. What's interesting is, always interesting in all this is, of course, if Francisco Caracolas get completed, then the Italians are off to the races. And under any scenario where they're not cumulatively limited in tonnage, I think the Italians do slow walk the Francisco Caracolas into completion. Because they are such a great upgrade, they immediately nullify all the French upgrades going on, and they give the Italians a wonderful qualitative boost, and it's their next entry in the qualitative race, which is going to scare the bejesus out of everyone, because they're going to have created the fast battleship, which is going to have another combination. So the point is, the moment you have Russia involved, you create so many different eddies in the flow of events that you can end up with a very different world very quickly. A very, very different world. Very, very quickly. Anyway, I always end these videos with a question, and I'm not going to change now. The question is going to be quite simple. It's an important one. How do you think Europe would look today if Germany had been broken up again? If Russia does survive and breaks Germany up, and the Treaty of Versailles breaks Germany up, do you think Germany would reunified by today, or would they have stayed as their independent small states? Would they have formed a sort of a loose federation at some point, or something like that? How do you think the world would have gone? Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it interesting. What have we got coming up next week? We have the USN Aircraft Carrier Squadron System, because that had to switch weeks because the books finally arrived this week. And as ever, if you like the video, please like, share, subscribe. As I've talked about at the beginning and a few other times, I have an issue for Christmas this year. I want the bet over. My mother has promised me if she wins this year, she's ending the bet. She has lost every year I've had a YouTube channel because my aunt keeps raising the figures. No more. If I win this year, if we win this year, she wins this year, it will be ended. There will be no more bet on it. And I will no longer have to deal with that conversation on Christmas Day. So please. And if you'd like to support the channel, if you'd like to support my Iron Brew supply, there is Ko-fi and things. There's memberships in the channel, which come with emojis. And if you want to suggest topics like this one, there's Patreon, where membership is, there is all sorts of tiers depending on what you want to be involved and how much merchandise you would like, etc. But all members of the Patreon get to suggest topics. I think the suggestions are live currently now for for April, and get to vote on topics when they've been when they've all been suggested. I take them, I put them in a group, and I set them all up, and I sort them out to make sure that if there's ones which are similar to each other, I try and combine them or pick the best one. And if I think I can do them all in the time allowed and with the facilities I have available, they're not asking me to rewrite War and Peace, I put them into a system on Patreon, which allows you to vote on Patreon, and you can vote for which ones should be chosen, and you can vote for as many as you like, and the ones which get the most votes, which the most people have liked, are the two which are done. I think it's a good system. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.